When I opened the safe that morning, I knew something was wrong before I counted a single dollar. My name is Margaret Lawson. I am 73 years old, and for more than 2 decades, I kept our family's emergency funds and important documents inside a heavy steel safe hidden behind a cabinet in my home office. Only a handful of people knew it existed. Even fewer knew how to access it. That Tuesday started like any other. I woke up before sunrise, made myself a cup of coffee, and reviewed a list of bills that needed attention before the end of the month. One of those payments came from a reserve fund I rarely touched. After breakfast, I walked into my office, closed the door behind me, and unlocked the cabinet. Everything seemed normal. The safe sat exactly where it always had. There were no scratches. No signs of forced entry. No indication that anything had happened. I entered the code and opened the door. At first, I simply stared. Something felt different. The envelopes were not arranged the way I remembered. The document folder sat slightly farther back than usual. I reached inside and began counting. Then I counted again. Then a third time. The money was gone. Not all of it. Just enough to make my heart sink. Several $1,000s had disappeared. I immediately checked the paperwork. A property document was missing. So was a signed financial authorization form I kept for emergencies. I sat down slowly and tried to convince myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Perhaps I had moved the funds months earlier and forgotten. Perhaps I had placed the documents somewhere else. Age can play tricks on memory. At least that is what I told myself. For the next hour, I searched every drawer, every filing cabinet, and every storage box in the office. Nothing. The money had not been moved. It had vanished. Around noon, Ethan stopped by unexpectedly. My son often visited during the week, and under normal circumstances, I would have been happy to see him. That day felt different. He seemed distracted. Tired. When I mentioned reviewing family finances, I noticed something unusual. His smile disappeared for just a second. Then it returned. The moment was brief, but I saw it. Later that evening, after Ethan left, I returned to the office. I examined the room more carefully than before. That was when I remembered the small security camera mounted near the bookshelf. Years ago, after a neighborhood break-in, I had installed it and almost forgotten it existed. My pulse quickened as I opened the recording system on my computer. I selected footage from the previous week and began reviewing the timeline. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then a figure appeared entering the office while I was away. I froze. The person walked directly toward the cabinet that concealed the safe. For several seconds, I simply stared at the screen. The image was grainy, but the person moved with purpose. There was no hesitation. No wandering around the room. Whoever entered knew exactly where they were going. The figure walked directly to the cabinet, opened it, and remained there for several minutes before leaving. I leaned closer to the monitor and replayed the footage. Then I replayed it again. The angle made identification difficult, but one detail immediately caught my attention. The person wore a dark jacket that looked familiar. Very familiar. My stomach tightened. I checked the date and timestamp. The recording had been made on a Thursday afternoon. I remembered that day clearly because I had spent most of it volunteering at the community center across town. The house had been nearly empty. I opened my calendar and compared the timestamp against my schedule. Then I began checking other recordings. What I found only deepened my concern. The same person appeared more than once. Different days. Different times. Always entering the office while I was away. Always moving toward the cabinet. I sat back in my chair and rubbed my temples. There had to be an explanation. There simply had to be. The next morning, I reviewed my financial records. Every withdrawal from the reserve fund should have been documented. That was how I had managed family finances for years. I opened old ledgers, bank statements, and payment logs. Nothing was missing from the records themselves. The money had not been officially transferred. It had not been deposited elsewhere. According to every document in front of me, the funds should still have been sitting inside the safe. Yet they were gone. Around noon, Nicole called to ask whether I would be attending Emma's college orientation meeting the following week. During our conversation, she casually mentioned that Ethan had been spending more time at the house recently. "He likes checking in on you," she said warmly. The comment stayed with me long after the call ended. Later that afternoon, I reviewed the security footage again. This time I focused on timing rather than appearance. A pattern quickly emerged. Nearly every visit occurred on days when Ethan knew I would be out. Volunteer work, doctor appointments, church events. The realization made me uncomfortable. I wanted to dismiss it. I wanted to believe coincidence was responsible. But the pattern refused to disappear. That evening, I opened a drawer containing spare house keys and access records. Years ago, I had written down everyone who could enter certain parts of the property. The list was short. Extremely short. When I finished reviewing it, one fact became impossible to ignore. Very few people knew where the safe was located. Even fewer knew the office well enough to move around without searching. And among those names, only one person appeared repeatedly in my mind. Ethan Lawson. Then I noticed something else. 3 of the recorded office visits happened during the exact same month his business began showing signs of trouble. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the security footage playing again. The figure entering my office. The familiar jacket. The careful movements. The timing that matched my absences almost perfectly. By sunrise, I knew I could not ignore what I had discovered. Still, suspicion and proof were not the same thing. Ethan was my son. I needed facts. After breakfast, I gathered several years of financial records and spread them across the dining room table. My reserve fund had always served one purpose. It existed to protect the family during emergencies. Whenever money left that fund, there was documentation. Receipts. Notes. Authorization forms. Something. This time, there was nothing. As I reviewed the records, another detail began to emerge. Several withdrawals from my personal accounts had occurred around the same periods when the missing cash likely disappeared from the safe. The withdrawals themselves were legitimate because I had approved them. Home repairs. Medical expenses. Property taxes. Yet the timing created a disturbing pattern. Whenever family finances became strained, reserve money seemed to vanish shortly afterward. Around noon, I called Brian Keller, the financial advisor who had occasionally assisted our family over the years. Brian was careful with information and respected privacy, but he also cared about our family. We met at his office later that afternoon. I explained my concerns without making accusations. Brian listened quietly. When I finished, he folded his hands and looked at me thoughtfully. "Margaret, I cannot discuss confidential details about other clients," he said. "But I can tell you something general." My heart began to race. Brian continued carefully. "The last 2 years have been difficult for many small business owners." I nodded. Ethan owned a regional supply company that had always seemed successful. Brian hesitated before speaking again. "Some people have experienced much more pressure than their families realize." The statement sounded simple, but something in his tone caught my attention. "Are you talking about Ethan?" I asked. Brian immediately looked away. He did not answer. He did not need to. His silence told me more than words could have. Driving home, I replayed the conversation repeatedly. For years, Ethan had assured everyone that business was strong. Family gatherings, holiday dinners, birthday celebrations. He always appeared confident, successful, stable. What if that image was not entirely true? Later that evening, I opened a folder containing public business records and local reports. Most were routine filings. Then I noticed several references to delayed projects connected to Ethan's company. Nothing catastrophic. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to suggest trouble beneath the surface. The more I read, the more uneasy I became. Shortly before midnight, I sat alone in my office studying a timeline I had created from the records. Dates from the security footage. Missing cash. Business setbacks. Financial pressures. Several events aligned almost perfectly. Then my phone rang. The caller was Brian Keller. His voice sounded unusually serious. "Margaret," he said quietly, "there is something else you should know. Ethan may be dealing with debts that are much larger than anyone in the family realizes." For several minutes after Brian ended the call, I remained seated in silence. The office felt unusually small. The papers spread across my desk suddenly seemed heavier than before. "Debts much larger than anyone realizes." Those were the exact words he had used. I stared at the timeline in front of me and tried to make sense of everything. Missing money. Security footage. Business difficulties. None of it proved Ethan had taken anything from the safe. Yet every new discovery seemed to point in the same direction. The following morning, I called Daniel Morris. Daniel had been one of my late husband's closest friends for decades. He was practical, patient, and remarkably good at noticing details other people overlooked. If anyone could help me review the situation objectively, it was Daniel. By noon, he was sitting across from me in the home office. Together we examined every record I had gathered. Security logs. Financial notes. Calendar entries. Property documents. Daniel said very little at first. He simply studied the evidence carefully. After nearly 2 hours, he placed one finger on the timeline. "Look at this," he said quietly. I leaned forward. Daniel pointed to several dates spread across a 2-year period. The dates matched visits captured on the security footage. More importantly, they aligned with periods when Ethan's company appeared to be struggling. Delayed projects. Reduced contracts. Missed expansion plans. None of the problems were catastrophic individually. Together, however, they painted a different picture. "This is not one bad month," Daniel said. "This looks like a long pattern." His observation unsettled me because it felt true. For years, Ethan had worked hard to project confidence. He always spoke about future opportunities. New clients. New contracts. Growth plans. Looking back, I realized those conversations had become increasingly vague. Later that afternoon, Daniel helped me organize the records into categories. As we worked, another troubling detail emerged. Small amounts of money seemed to have disappeared periodically long before the larger loss from the safe. A few $100s here. 1,000 there. Amounts small enough to escape immediate attention. I felt a chill run through me. If our calculations were correct, the recent disappearance was not the beginning. It was the largest incident in a much longer sequence. Daniel looked at me carefully. "Margaret, whoever did this was counting on nobody noticing the pattern." I knew he was right. By evening, we had assembled a clearer timeline than ever before. Then Daniel discovered something unexpected buried inside an old financial folder. It was a copy of a business registration update connected to Ethan's company. At first glance, it seemed routine. Then we noticed a secondary account listed among the supporting records. Neither of us recognized it. The account number appeared only once and was attached to a recent filing. My pulse quickened. Daniel immediately began comparing dates. The account had been established shortly before several of the unexplained losses occurred. I stared at the document for a long moment. The room felt completely silent. Finally, Daniel looked up from the paperwork. His expression had changed. "Margaret," he said carefully, "I think we may have just found a hidden account connected to Ethan." For the next 24 hours, I could think about little else. The hidden account sat at the center of every question now. I did not know exactly what it was for, but I knew one thing with certainty. Ethan had never mentioned it. If the account was harmless, why keep it hidden? If it was legitimate, why did it appear at the exact moment money began disappearing from family reserves? The questions followed me everywhere. The following afternoon, Ethan stopped by the house unexpectedly. We sat together in the kitchen drinking coffee just as we had done countless times over the years. I studied him carefully while we talked. He looked exhausted. There were dark circles beneath his eyes that had not been there a year earlier. His smile seemed forced. Even his posture looked different. For a moment, I felt guilty for suspecting him. Then I remembered the missing money. I remembered the security footage. I remembered the hidden account. "How is business?" I asked casually. Ethan looked down at his coffee cup. "Busy," he replied. "The usual challenges." The answer sounded rehearsed. I nodded and waited. He offered nothing more. Normally, Ethan loved discussing work. New opportunities. Future plans. Growth projections. This time he seemed eager to change the subject. That alone told me something. Before leaving, he hugged me and thanked me for lunch. As I watched him drive away, my heart felt heavier than ever. I did not want the evidence to point toward my son. But evidence does not care what we want. Later that evening, Nicole called. Her voice sounded unusually tense. At first, we discussed ordinary family matters. Then she asked a question that immediately caught my attention. "Have you spoken with Ethan about finances recently?" I remained silent for a moment. "Why do you ask?" Nicole hesitated. "No reason. I was just curious." The conversation ended shortly afterward, but something about it felt wrong. Very wrong. 2 days later, another unexpected development occurred. Emma arrived at my house carrying a large envelope. She seemed nervous. Almost reluctant. "Grandma, I found something while cleaning the storage closet in the garage," she said. I invited her inside, and we sat together at the dining room table. Emma placed the envelope in front of me. "I think this belongs to you." Inside were copies of financial notices, payment reminders, and business correspondence. Most were addressed to Ethan. As I reviewed them, a troubling picture began to emerge. Several notices referenced overdue obligations. Others referenced missed payment deadlines. None of the amounts were small. My stomach tightened with every page. Emma watched quietly. Finally, she spoke. "There is one more thing." I looked up. Her expression had changed. She seemed deeply uncomfortable. "A few months ago, I came home early from class. I saw Dad in your office." The room suddenly felt colder. Emma lowered her voice. "He did not know I was there. And Grandma, I watched him walk straight to the cabinet where you keep the safe." For several moments after Emma finished speaking, neither of us said a word. The envelope remained open on the table between us. Around us, the house was completely quiet. I could hear the ticking of the clock in the hallway and the distant hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Ordinary sounds. Yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. Emma looked down at her hands. "I never told anyone because I did not think it mattered at the time," she said softly. "I thought maybe Dad was looking for paperwork." I nodded slowly. Part of me wanted to accept that explanation. Another part knew the situation had moved far beyond innocent possibilities. The security footage. The missing money. The financial notices. The hidden account. Now Emma's observation. Every piece seemed to fit together. Later that evening, after Emma left, I spread everything across the dining room table. Documents from Brian. Notes from Daniel. Security logs. Calendar records. Business correspondence. For hours, I organized the information into a timeline. As midnight approached, a painful pattern became impossible to ignore. Each major financial setback connected to Ethan's business had been followed by activity around my office or unexplained changes involving family funds. The connection was not perfect, but it was strong enough to make my heart ache. The following morning, Daniel returned to help me review everything one final time. We sat together beneath the soft light of the dining room chandelier. Neither of us rushed. The stakes felt too important. Around noon, Daniel leaned back in his chair and sighed heavily. "Margaret, if this were anyone else, what would you conclude?" The question hit harder than I expected. because I already knew the answer. If the evidence pointed toward a stranger, I would have considered it overwhelming. But this was not a stranger. This was my son. That afternoon, Nicole called again. Her voice sounded tired. More tired than before. We spoke for several minutes about ordinary family matters before she unexpectedly became emotional. "I wish Ethan would tell people when he needs help," she said quietly. My pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" There was a long pause. "He carries everything by himself. The business. The debt. The pressure. Debt." Hearing the words spoken aloud changed something. Until that moment, most of my concerns had been built on evidence and suspicion. Now someone inside his own household had confirmed the problem existed. Nicole quickly changed the subject afterward, but the damage had already been done. That evening, I sat alone in the living room watching old family videos. Birthdays. Graduations. Holiday gatherings. Ethan appeared in every one of them. Smiling. Laughing. Carrying his daughter on his shoulders. Helping his father repair things around the house. I kept asking myself the same question. What had happened to bring us here? The answer remained unclear. Near sunset the next day, Emma arrived once more. This time she carried a small notebook. "Grandma," she said nervously, "there is something else I remembered." I invited her inside. She opened the notebook and pointed to a date written several months earlier. Then she looked directly at me. "That was the day I saw Dad leave your office carrying a large envelope. And later that same night, I overheard him tell Mom that he had finally solved one of his biggest money problems." Emma's words stayed with me long after she left that evening. I sat alone at the dining room table staring at the notebook she had brought. The date she recorded matched one of the days captured by the security camera. It also matched a period when several $1,000s disappeared from the reserve fund. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt as though I was no longer chasing possibilities. I was standing in front of a truth I did not want to see. The next morning, I invited Daniel Morris back to the house. Together, we reviewed every piece of information one final time. The security footage. The financial notices. The business records. The hidden account. Emma's observations. Nicole's comments about debt. When arranged side by side, the evidence formed a picture that was painfully clear. Daniel remained quiet for several minutes before speaking. "Margaret, I think you already know what happened." I looked down at the papers. "Yes," I answered softly. "I think I do." Yet knowing was not enough. I needed to hear the truth from Ethan himself. I owed him that opportunity. More importantly, I owed myself that certainty. Later that afternoon, I called Nicole. Her voice sounded nervous the moment she answered. I asked if the family could gather for dinner the following weekend. Nothing unusual. Just a family dinner. She agreed immediately. Before ending the call, she hesitated. "Is everything all right?" she asked. I paused briefly. "We will talk when everyone is together." After the call ended, I could not shake the feeling that she already suspected what was coming. Over the next few days, I prepared carefully. Not for a confrontation. For a conversation. I organized documents into folders. I printed copies of timelines and financial records. I reviewed the security footage again and again. Every step felt emotionally exhausting. There were moments when I wanted to stop. Moments when I considered locking everything away and pretending none of it had happened. But every time that thought appeared, I remembered the missing money was only part of the problem. The deeper wound was the secrecy. The silence. The erosion of trust. 2 days before the dinner, Brian Keller called once more. He had learned additional information regarding Ethan's financial situation. Although he remained careful about confidential details, he confirmed something important. The pressure Ethan faced had been growing for years. Not months. Years. The revelation explained many things but excused none of them. On the morning of the family gathering, I woke before sunrise. The house felt unusually still. As I prepared coffee, I looked around the kitchen where so many family memories had been created. Birthdays, celebrations, holidays. I wondered whether those same memories would survive what was about to happen. By late afternoon, family members began arriving. Nicole seemed anxious. Emma remained unusually quiet. Ethan appeared tired but tried to act normal. I greeted everyone warmly and invited them inside. As the evening progressed, conversation filled the dining room. Yet beneath every smile and every polite exchange, I could feel the weight of what was coming. Then dinner ended. I stood slowly from my chair, picked up the folder beside me, and looked directly at my son. "Ethan," I said calmly, "there are some things we need to discuss tonight." The room became completely silent the moment I spoke. Ethan looked up from his chair, confusion flickering across his face. Nicole immediately lowered her eyes. Emma sat perfectly still. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Then I placed the folder on the dining room table and opened it carefully. "I have spent several weeks trying to understand something," I said calmly. "At first, I believed I had made a mistake. Then I believed there must be another explanation. Now I simply want the truth." Ethan stared at me without speaking. I removed several documents and slid them across the table. Security records, financial timelines, copies of notices Emma had discovered, notes from Daniel. I explained everything step by step. I never raised my voice. I never accused him directly. I simply presented the facts in the order I had uncovered them. As the evidence accumulated, the atmosphere in the room changed. Ethan's expression slowly hardened. Nicole looked increasingly uncomfortable. Emma remained quiet but determined. When I reached the security footage timeline, Ethan finally interrupted. "Mom, what exactly are you trying to say?" His voice sounded strained. I met his eyes. "I am asking you to help me understand why money disappeared from the family reserve fund and why so many of these events seem connected to your financial difficulties." The question hung heavily in the air. Ethan immediately looked away. That single reaction spoke volumes. Nicole closed her eyes briefly. Nobody rushed to defend him. Nobody challenged the evidence. For the first time all evening, I sensed that everyone at the table already understood more than they had admitted. I continued calmly. I explained how the dates aligned. How the office visits matched my absences. How the hidden account appeared during the same period the losses increased. Then I placed Emma's notebook beside the other documents. "And finally," I said softly, "there is the testimony of someone who loves you very much." Ethan looked toward his daughter. Emma's hands trembled slightly, but she did not look away. "Dad," she said quietly, "I saw you leave Grandma's office carrying an envelope. And later I heard you say one of your biggest money problems had been solved." The room fell silent again. Ethan buried his face in his hands. Several seconds passed. Then 30. Then nearly a full minute. Nobody spoke. Finally, Nicole began crying softly. "I told you this would not stay hidden forever," she whispered. Ethan slowly lifted his head. The confidence he usually carried was completely gone. He looked exhausted. Defeated. For a moment, I saw not a middle-aged businessman, but the little boy I had raised. A boy who was frightened and overwhelmed. Ethan looked around the table before settling his eyes on me. His voice barely rose above a whisper. "Mom, there is something all of you need to know." Every person in the room froze. Even Nicole stopped crying. Ethan swallowed hard and stared at the documents spread before him. Then he took a long breath and finally began to speak about the secret he had been hiding for years. Ethan stared at the table for several seconds before speaking again. His hands trembled slightly as he gathered his thoughts. When he finally looked up, his eyes were filled with exhaustion rather than defiance. "The business started struggling almost 3 years ago," he said quietly. "At first I thought I could fix it on my own. Every problem seemed temporary. Every setback felt manageable. I kept telling myself the next contract would solve everything." Nobody interrupted. The room remained completely silent. Ethan continued. Then the debts started growing. Projects were delayed. Clients backed out. I borrowed money to keep things running. When that was not enough, I borrowed more. Nicole lowered her head. It was obvious she had known part of the story but not all of it. Ethan swallowed hard. I was ashamed. I did not want anyone to know I was failing. Hearing the word failing seemed to cost him something. He looked toward me. Especially you, Mom. My heart ached, but I remained silent. Ethan took a long breath. The first time I opened the safe, I convinced myself it was only a loan. I told myself I would replace the money before anyone noticed. Then another problem appeared. Then another. Eventually I stopped solving problems and started hiding them. The truth settled heavily over the room. No dramatic revelation remained. Only consequences. Ethan admitted that the hidden account had been created to manage mounting obligations he believed he could eventually overcome. He admitted that money from the reserve fund had been used to keep creditors from taking action against his company. He admitted taking the missing documents because he feared losing access to financial options that might buy him more time. Every confession matched the evidence we had uncovered. When he finished speaking, nobody moved. Finally, Emma wiped tears from her eyes. Dad, why did you not ask for help? She whispered. Ethan looked at his daughter and shook his head. Because I was afraid you would all see me differently. The answer broke something inside me. Not because it justified what happened. Because it explained it. Fear had grown into secrecy. Secrecy had become deception. Deception had damaged trust. I slowly stood and walked to the window. For a moment, I looked out at the dark backyard where Ethan had once played as a child. Then I turned back toward the table. The money matters, I said calmly. But it is not the greatest loss. Everyone looked at me. The greatest loss is that you carried this alone while choosing dishonesty instead of family. Tears filled Ethan's eyes. He nodded silently. Over the following weeks, difficult conversations continued. Financial records were reviewed. Repayment plans were created. Professional assistance was arranged. Nothing was fixed overnight. Trust rarely works that way. Yet something important had changed. The truth was finally visible. There were no more secrets hiding in envelopes, hidden accounts, or locked drawers. Several months later, our family gathered again around the same dining room table. The atmosphere felt different. Lighter. Honest. Ethan was rebuilding both his finances and his relationships one step at a time. Nicole no longer carried uncertainty. Emma no longer carried worry. As for me, I had learned a lesson I would never forget. The money inside the safe could be replaced. The documents could be recovered. But trust requires constant protection. That evening, after everyone went home, I locked the safe and turned off the office light. For the first time in a very long time, I felt at peace. Not because everything had been restored. Because the truth no longer had anywhere left to hide.